HighBridge, a division of Recorded Books, presents From Cold War to Hot Peace, An American Ambassador in Putin's Russia, by Michael McFaul. Read by L.J. Ganser. Prologue. As Air Force One began its initial descent into Prague on a clear, sunny day in April 2010, President Obama asked Gary Seymour and me to join him in his office at the front of the plane to run over the final talking points for his meeting with Russian President Dmitry Medvedev later that day. The president was in an ebullient mood. In the same city, a year earlier, Obama had given what may have been his most important foreign policy speech to date, calling for a nuclear-free world. Now, just a year later, he was delivering a major piece of business toward his Prague agenda, as we called it. With his Russian partner, he was about to sign the new Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty, New START, reducing by 30% the number of nuclear weapons allowed in the two countries. Seymour, our special assistant to the president for weapons of mass destruction at the National Security Council, was our lead at the White House in getting this treaty done. I was his wingman. So this quick trip to Prague was a day of celebration for the two of us as well. On the tarmac, Obama asked Gary and me to ride with him in his limousine, the Beast, to the majestic Prague Castle, where the signing ceremony would take place. For a while, we discussed our game plan for pushing Medvedev to support sanctions on Iran, but mostly the drive was a victory lap. Obama waved to the crowds on the streets, flashing his broad smile through the tinted bulletproof glass. We all felt good about getting something concrete done. Always a challenge in government work. We also allowed ourselves that day to imagine even deeper cooperation between the United States and Russia on issues beyond arms control. Maybe we truly had come to a turning point in the bumpy road of U.S. Russia relations since the collapse of the Soviet Union, a turn toward genuine strategic cooperation that had eluded previous American and Russian leaders. With new young presidents in the White House and in the Kremlin, the Cold War felt distant. We were signing the first major arms control treaty in decades, working together to stop Iran from acquiring a nuclear weapon, joined in efforts to fight the Taliban and al-Qaeda in Afghanistan, and increasing trade and investment between our two countries. We seemed to have put contentious issues such as NATO expansion and the Iraq War behind us, and we're now digging deeper into areas of mutual interest. That year, for instance, Russian and American paratroopers were jumping out of airplanes together in Colorado, conducting joint counter-terrorist training operations at the same time that American and Russian entrepreneurs were working together to develop Skolkovo, Russia's aspirational Silicon Valley. We were even discussing the possibilities of cooperating on missile defense. These were breakthroughs unimaginable just 2 years earlier. Medvedev seemed like a pro-Western modernizer, albeit a cautious one. On that celebratory drive through the cobblestone streets of Prague, the reset, the bumper sticker for Obama's Russia policy, appeared to be working. Later that afternoon, Medvedev and Obama signed the New START treaty, drank champagne together, and spoke glowingly about possibilities for further cooperation. At the time, solid majorities in both countries were convinced of such possibilities. Russia was popular in America, and America was popular in Russia. I flew home the next day in a great mood, convinced that we were making history. Only 2 years later, on a cold, dark day in January 2012, I arrived in Moscow as the new U.S. ambassador to the Russian Federation, charged with continuing the reset. I had thought about, written about, and worked toward closer relations with the Soviet Union and then Russia since my high school debating days, so this new mission should have been a crowning achievement of my career, an opportunity of a lifetime to further my ideas about American-Russian relations. It was not. On my first day of work at the embassy, the Russian state-controlled media accused President Obama of sending me to Russia to foment revolution. On his evening commentary show, Odnako, broadcast on the most popular television network in Russia, Mikhail Leontiev warned his viewers that I was neither a Russia expert nor a traditional diplomat, but a professional revolutionary whose assignment was to finance and organize Russia's political opposition as it plotted to overthrow the Russian government, to finish Russia's unfinished revolution, the title of one of my books written a decade earlier. This portrayal of my mission to Moscow would haunt me for the rest of my days as ambassador. A few months later, in May 2012, I accompanied my former boss at the White House, National Security Advisor Tom Donilon, to his meeting with President-elect Putin. This was the first meeting between a senior Obama official and Putin since Putin's re-election in March 2012. We met at Novo Ogaryovo, Putin's country estate, the same place where Obama had enjoyed a cordial, constructive 3-hour breakfast with the then Prime Minister 4 years earlier. Putin listened politely to Tom's arguments for continued cooperation. At some point in their dialogue, however, he turned away from Tom to stare intensely at me with his steely blue eyes and stern scowl to accuse me of purposely seeking to ruin U.S. Russia relations. Putin seemed genuinely angry with me. I was genuinely alarmed. The hair on the back of my neck stood on end, and sweat covered my brow as I endured this tongue-lashing from one of the most powerful people in the world. In Prague, I had been the author of The Reset, the driver of closer relations with Russia. In Moscow, I was now a revolutionary, a usurper, and Vladimir Putin's personal foe. What happened? How did we go from toasting the reset in Prague in 2010 to lamenting its end in Moscow just 2 years later? Nothing fundamental had changed in our policy toward Russia, nor had Russia done anything abroad that might trigger new animosity. That would come later. The one obvious change between these two meetings was Russia's leadership. Medvedev was president when we were in Prague to sign New START. Putin was elected president soon after my arrival in Moscow as U.S. ambassador. But that seemed too simple an explanation. After all, Putin was prime minister during the heyday of the reset, and most people thought he was calling the shots during that time. And then things became even worse. 2 years into his third term as Russian president, in February 2014, Putin invaded Ukraine, annexing Crimea and supporting separatist militias in the eastern part of the country. Not since World War II had a European country violated the sovereignty of another country in this way. Putin's outrageous and shocking actions reaffirmed the end of the reset, and with it, 3 decades of American and Russian leaders' efforts to build a more cooperative relationship after the end of the Cold War. The project of Russian integration into the West, started by Ronald Reagan and sustained to varying degrees by all post-Cold War presidents, was over. Sometime between the Obama-Medvedev summit in Prague in 2010 and Putin's invasion of Ukraine in 2014, public opinion in both countries also flipped. Solid majorities in both Russia and the United States now perceived each other as enemies. This new era of confrontation did not mark a return to the Cold War, exactly, but most certainly could be described as a hot peace. Unlike during the Cold War, the Kremlin today no longer promotes an ideology with worldwide appeal. Russian economic and military power is growing. But Russia has not obtained superpower status like the Soviet Union, and the entire globe is not divided between red and blue states, the communist bloc versus the free world, reinforced by opposing alliance structures. Russia today has very few allies. And yet our new era of hot peace has resurrected some features eerily reminiscent of the Cold War, while also adding new dimensions of confrontation. A new ideological struggle has emerged between Russia and the West, not between communism and capitalism, but between democracy and autocracy. Putin also has championed a new set of populist, nationalist, conservative ideas, antithetical to the liberal, international order anchored by the United States. Putinism now has admirers in Western democracies, just as communism did during the Cold War. Europe is divided again between East and West. The line has just moved farther east. Russia's military, economic, cyber, and informational capabilities to project power and ideas have also grown considerably in the last several years. And sometimes this hot peace has morphed into hot wars, not directly between the United States and Russia, but between proxies in Ukraine and Syria. And then there are some acts of Russian aggression that Soviet leaders during the Cold War never dared to attempt, including annexing territory in Ukraine and intervening in the 2016 U.S. presidential election. Khrushchev and Brezhnev confronted the United States around the world, even at times using military force as an instrument to fight the Cold War, but never annexed land or audaciously violated American sovereignty. As Putin's Russia has amassed new capabilities and greater intent to challenge the United States and the West more generally, America's standing as the leader of the free world and anchor of the liberal international order has waned. Compared to the Cold War, that's new too. Today's hot peace is not as dangerous as the worst moments of the Cold War, but most certainly is tenser than some of the more cooperative periods of the Cold War. What went wrong? Why did the end of the Cold War not produce closer relations between our two countries? Could this new tragic era of confrontation have been avoided? And what had I gotten wrong? From my days as a high school debater in Bozeman, Montana, in 1979 to my years as ambassador to Russia, ending in 2014, I had argued that closer relations with Moscow served American national interests. As a college student, I'd been so eager to deepen engagement with the Russians, or the Soviets back then, that I enrolled in first-year Russian in the fall quarter of my freshman year at Stanford University, and then traveled to what Ronald Reagan called the evil empire, against the wishes of my mother on my first trip abroad, to study in Leningrad in the summer of 1983. When the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, I again packed my bags and moved to Russia to help support market and democratic reforms there, believing that those changes would help bring our two countries closer together. Beginning on January 21st, 2009, I worked for President Obama at the National Security Council, and in 2012 I became his ambassador, animated by the belief that a more cooperative relationship served American national interests. I have spent the greater part of my life trying to deepen relations between Russia and the United States. But in 2014, all these efforts seemed for naught. Heightening my sense of frustration, I was banned by Putin from traveling to Russia. The first U.S. ambassador since George Kennan in 1952 to be barred entry to the country. What had I personally done wrong? Had I pursued the wrong strategies? Or had I embraced the wrong goals in the first place? This book seeks to answer these big, hard questions about Russian-American relations over the last 30 years, from my perspective as both analyst and participant. The story begins with the first reset in U.S.-Soviet relations in the Reagan-Gorbachev era, and ends with the last failed attempt initiated by President Obama. It's a complex story, shaped by Cold War legacies, punctuated by economic depression and civil wars, and interrupted by popular uprisings and foreign interventions. I will address all of these factors as potential causes of cooperation and confrontation. However, in my account, individuals, their ideas, and their decisions drive the narrative of U.S. Russia relations over the last 3 decades. Real people made decisions that sometimes produced cooperation and other times led to confrontation. Relations between the United States and Russia were not determined by the balance of power between our two countries, or by innate forces such as economic development, culture, history, or geography. Where others see destiny, determinism, and inevitability, I see choices, contingency, and opportunities, realized and missed. In this book, I evaluate both American and Russian leaders, their ideas, decisions, and behavior, by how well they succeeded in achieving what, in my view, were desirable and attainable objectives. I try to evaluate my own work through the same critical lens. U.S. leaders have certainly pursued policies that by turns nurtured and undermined cooperation with Russia. I will discuss how and why. I personally made some mistakes in both analysis and actions. Those are not glossed over here. But in my account, decisions and actions by Russian leaders, shaped in large part by their domestic politics, drive most of the drama in American-Russian relations, sometimes in a positive direction, other times in a negative direction. This book is one participant's recollections, not a dispassionate history of U.S. Russian relations over the last 30 years. As I have learned from writing other scholarly books, memories are imperfect sources for the writing of history. It is too soon to draft the definitive account of these events, especially those that occurred in the Obama era, because almost none of the important documents, including ones that I wrote, have been declassified. Few of the central decision-makers in Russia or the United States have been interviewed. Only a handful of the central policymakers in the United States have written memoirs. The memoir literature from Russian decision-makers is even thinner. On some big policy issues during the Obama era, such as Iran and Syria, I also recognize that I participated in only a portion of the policymaking, that which had to do with Russia. Others in our government will have to write their accounts to complete the picture. And as this book goes to press, the role of Russia in the 2016 U.S. presidential election is a story still unfolding. This book is an early, interpretive take, my take, on this era in U.S.-Russia relations. I hope it will stimulate and inform other scholars in the writing of more definitive studies in the future. By design, this book is a mix of abstract analysis, historical narrative, and personal anecdote. I hope that President Obama, my fellow policy wonks in government, my colleagues at Stanford, and my mother in Montana will all read it. That's a tall order. My mom will tire when reading about telemetry, and my academic colleagues may not be that intrigued by the two-step. Therefore, I give all listeners license to skip those passages not of interest to them, which I trust can be done without losing the arc of the story. Scholars will quickly identify the social science theories that shaped both the analysis in this book and my thinking about policy while in government. But I deliberately hid, rather than highlighted, the academic scaffolding and academic references to allow for better storytelling. I also wrote this book from the sometimes competing perspectives of scholar, policymaker, diplomat, and Montanan. Rather than try to maintain one voice, I deliberately deployed these multiple standpoints because I am all of these things, and therefore my understanding of and engagement in Russian-American relations was shaped by these multiple dimensions. These tensions in the book accurately reflect those tensions in my life. 1. The First Reset. I was born during the height of the Cold War, a year after Kennedy and Khrushchev nearly blew up the world. Growing up in Montana, where ICBMs are located, nuclear attack drills in the classroom were the only connection I had to Russia, the USSR, and the Cold War. I first became interested in the Soviet Union through a high school debate class, a course I'd selected only because of its reputation as an easy English credit. That class, however, set the course for my professional life. The debate topic that year was how to improve U.S. trade policy. And so my partner, Steve Daines, now a U.S. Senator from Montana, and I tried to come up with an obscure case. We called them squirrels. That would be unfamiliar to other debaters in Montana. We settled on the repeal of Jackson-Vanik, an amendment to the 1974 Trade Act that denied the Soviet Union normal trade relations with the United States until the Kremlin allowed Jews to emigrate freely. I would not have predicted back then that this gimmicky debate strategy would spark an enduring interest in the Soviet Union and then Russia, or that I'd actually be part of the government team that lifted Jackson-Vanik 3 decades later. In high school, I started to develop my ideas about reset with Russia. If we could just engage with the Soviets more directly, Maybe we could reduce tensions in our bilateral relations, or so I believed at the time. I developed this theory of great power relations more systematically as a college student. My first year at Stanford was Ronald Reagan's first year in the White House, when he was advocating for the need to challenge the evil empire, fight global communism, and restore America to its former greatness. As a freshman, I enrolled in first-year Russian and Intro to International Relations, because I thought Reagan was dangerous. I worried that his confrontational policies toward Moscow would lead to nuclear war. I thought he exaggerated the Soviet threat, spooking us into thinking that the Soviets wanted to take over the world. And what was so wrong with the idea of greater equality, an idea that Soviet communists allegedly advocated anyway? Or, so I speculated back then with sympathetic housemates at Stanford's hippie co-op, Synergy. We needed to be reaching out to the Russians, not threatening them. If we could just get to know each other better, we could reduce tensions. I was not the only American worried about World War back then. In 1983, 100 million viewers tuned into ABC to watch The Day After, a made-for-TV movie that graphically depicted nuclear war between the Soviet Union and the United States. It was a scary time. The Cold War seemed like it could become hot. I wanted to do something about it. The way to test my hypotheses was to go to the Soviet Union and get to know the people that I thought we should be engaging. So I traveled to Leningrad, as St. Petersburg was called back then, in the summer of 1983 to participate in a language program for Americans. When my mother sent me off to college, she worried that I would go to California and come back with long hair and radical ideas. Imagine her horror when I called her to report that my first trip abroad would be not to London or Paris, but the evil empire. The Soviet Union I encountered that summer seemed neither scary nor oppressive. Yes, the sausage had tons of fat in it. Yes, we avoided using ice cubes to cool our drinks, for fear of giardia in the water. And yes, you had to stand in line for an hour for vanilla ice cream sprinkled with a few chocolate flakes. Usually, there were no other choices. But Russians did not seem poor or deprived. The paint may have been peeling on some of the buildings, the stores may have been empty, but Leningrad was a grand, impressive city, made all the more magical by the White Nights phenomenon in June. The Soviet government discouraged its citizens from talking to foreigners, and especially Americans back then. But, to my surprise, the Russians who risked talking to me and my compatriots, admittedly not a representative sample, were friendly and curious. Many were even Led Zeppelin fans, just like me. We seemed more alike than different. Our governments might have been rivals, but our peoples were not. If we just made an effort to get to know them, to show respect, to find common ground based on mutual interests, we could get along with the Soviets. Or so I believed with even greater conviction after that summer. If my first trip to the USSR affirmed my theory of peace through engagement, my second trip in 1985 challenged it. This time I was in dreary Moscow, not Imperial Leningrad, and in January, not June. With somewhat better language skills and more connections, I dug deeper into the complex, contradictory fabric of Soviet society. I met refuseniks, black marketeers, the spoiled children of Communist Party leaders, and otherwise intelligent university students who nonetheless repeated inane slogans about the virtues of communism and the evils of capitalism. I rushed to stand in long, snaking lines for toilet paper and bananas. I hid in the closet one night when my terrified Russian hosts answered the door and reported to police that no foreigners were present in their apartment. I watched brave believers defy barricades to attend midnight Easter services. I shopped at the mall, at the International Hotel, where only foreigners and hard currency were allowed. I lost 20 pounds because it was genuinely difficult to find food. and would have lost even more without the stews that my kind Ghanaian dorm room friend Adam shared with me. Life was hard in this communist paradise. I sold books on the black market to pay the 72 rubles, the equivalent of $83 in 1985, to make a 6-minute phone call to my girlfriend, now my wife, Donna. This system was corrupt. This system was repressive. This system didn't work. This time around, I witnessed and experienced communist dictatorship more closely, and didn't like it. That semester in Moscow hardened my convictions about the importance of liberty, freedom, and democracy. I no longer believed that engagement between our two countries was enough. I started to consider an alternative theory. Only democratic change inside the Soviet Union would allow our two governments and our two societies to come closer together. That possibility seemed very remote in the winter of 1985, but a little less remote after Mikhail Gorbachev emerged on the scene. I was living in Moscow the day Gorbachev became General Secretary of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. News of the appointment didn't come until a few days later, however, as the Soviet media delayed announcing the death of General Secretary Chernenko. That's how totalitarian the regime was. It could even postpone death and freeze time. My first glimpses on television of the new leader inspired hope. He was not a comrade of the original Bolsheviks or a hero of the Great Patriotic War, what the Russians call World War II. He was too young. My Russian friends saw these biographical and generational characteristics as reasons to dream of a better future, not democracy or markets, but a reformed communism. Some U.S. leaders also sensed early on the difference in Gorbachev. Vice President George H.W. Bush and Secretary of State George Shultz led the American delegation to Chernenko's funeral in Moscow and squeezed in a meet and greet at the embassy, to which a friendly diplomat invited the few dozen American students in the city. It was my first chance to listen to genuine Cold Warriors up close, but Shultz, who would later become a mentor of mine at Stanford, didn't sound like a Cold War hawk that day. He hinted at fresh possibilities in U.S.-Soviet relations with a new leader in the Kremlin. That night, I left Uncle Sam's, the embassy bar where we'd gathered, feeling upbeat about my decision to study in the USSR. The food was awful and the winter was long, but maybe this was a place where big history was going to be made. In the spring of 1985, Gorbachev assumed control of a political and economic system that was not performing well. Economic growth rates had declined for decades. The Soviet leadership allocated huge resources to the military-industrial complex, creating shortages of consumer goods. Inefficiencies in distribution opened opportunities for black market traders. Above all, the command economy of state-controlled prices and wages, as well as the lack of private property, suppressed incentives for work and innovation. In the winter of 1985, I learned from Russian friends a perfect saying to describe the system. We pretend to work, they pretend to pay. And yet Gorbachev was not pressured to reform this economic system. State control of news and information kept societal expectations low, and Gorbachev and others in the Politburo could have muddled through comfortably for years, if not decades, on the profits of energy exports. A handful of dissidents challenged the regime episodically, but no organized political opposition ever emerged. Reagan's military buildup worried the Kremlin and strained the Soviet reach around the globe, but the system could have survived without major economic reforms well into the 21st century. A different Soviet leader might have stayed the course. Gorbachev made conscious decisions to depart from business as usual. The new Soviet leader was an idealist. He did not accept the world as it was. Rather, he sought to remake it as he thought it should be. He believed in socialism, but wanted to make it work better. Those beliefs motivated him to initiate a series of economic reforms aimed at making the existing economic system more efficient. His first idea was uskureni, or the acceleration of economic development. It was
Sample complete. Ready to continue?